Welcome to Habeas Treasures, where I try to decipher this book, There's Treasure Inside by Jon Collins-Black, in order to find one of the 5 hidden treasures. On today's episode, I'll continue my breakdown of the Pokemon Box chapter, and specifically the links I've uncovered between the Pokemon story and another treasure hunt from 2017 that could unlock the secrets that help us find the box. Let's begin. When I was researching previous treasure hunts to get an idea of the types of puzzles and ciphers used by other hunt creators, I came across this book, Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon, that immediately reminded me of the Pokemon Box chapter. Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon is a novel by Pete Bissonnette, and it's about 5 friends who set off on a road trip to find a hidden treasure. The book also contains clues to find a real-life treasure worth $55,000. The treasure was found in 2017 by this family in Arkansas at Hot Springs National Park. So what were the similarities between the story in Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon and the Pokemon Box chapter? Let's go through them. First is the idea of 5 people taking a road trip connected to a treasure. In the Pokemon Box chapter, the 5 are the author, his 2 parents, and his 2 grandparents. And in Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon, the characters are friends who refer to themselves as the Butterscotch 5. Second, the starting point of the hunts is the same, New Orleans, Louisiana. In Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon, the main character and narrator of the story is named Nelson Ware. And if you anagram his name, you uncover the starting point of the hunt, New Orleans. And in the Pokemon Box chapter, the story begins with the family's overnight stay at a New Orleans hotel near the French Quarter. Next is the focus on breakfast in both stories. Though not a major plot point in the story itself, the fact that breakfast is in the title of the book, Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon, I think is significant. And in the Pokemon Box chapter, the author goes into significant detail describing the breakfast that his family had during their stay in New Orleans. He writes, "Eventually, the 5 of us went down to the hotel lobby for breakfast. I scarfed down my scrambled eggs and stared out the window of the hotel cafe, watching people walk by. The adults ate slowly, and when my mother at last finished her final bite of sausage and toast, my father announced that it was time to go for a walk." Let's stop and consider this part of the story for a minute. I think it's reasonable to assume that since the author was 5½ at the time of the trip, he doesn't actually remember 40 plus years later what he or his mother had for breakfast that morning. So why include scrambled eggs and sausage and toast? I have some ideas on that, which I'll cover later in the video, but for now, let's continue with the similarities between the 2 stories. I picked up on another possible title connection later in the story when the author describes his journey with the Froakie to hide the treasure. He writes, "And we won't see any bouffallant either, just so you know," he added. "I didn't tell him I already knew this, as I had done at least a modicum of research before we left." As you can see, a bouffallant Pokemon looks a lot like a buffalo, and the word modicum means a small amount or a trace. I believe the author is making a reference to a popular brand of Kentucky bourbon called Buffalo Trace. And it turns out that Buffalo Trace bourbon is repeatedly mentioned throughout the book, Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon. In fact, it's the favorite bourbon of the author, Pete Bissonnette. In addition to giving away a case of Buffalo Trace to the winner of the riddle contest that he launched after the book was solved, Pete Bissonnette is actually honored at the Buffalo Trace Distillery in Kentucky with his name etched into a brick. And believe me when I say, Buffalo Trace is a huge part of the Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon book.
Hello and welcome to the solution reveal for the Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon riddle. I'm Pete Bissonnette, Learning Strategies, and cheers. And yes, it's Buffalo Trace, and soon you're going to be learning who won the case of bourbon for solving the riddle. So since I said cheers.
Okay, so we have connections in both stories to breakfast and bourbon, but what about tea, the other word in the title? At first, I was confused by this because I couldn't find any references to tea in the Pokemon story, but then I remembered the intro section to part 2 of the book and this line. "If you find a particular chapter too whimsical for your liking, I hope you will forgive me. Another person might find that solve just their brand of tea." Now, the only part 2 chapter that really fits the description of whimsical is the Pokemon Box chapter, so I think it's safe to assume this line is intended as a clue for the Pokemon Box. And in Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon, the favorite tea brand of the author is Fortnum and Mason. Another interesting connection between the 2 stories is the major emphasis on frogs in both books. In the Pokemon Box chapter, in addition to the very frog-like Froakie, the author also includes the Fabergé frog with the red ruby eyes. When introducing us to the Froakie, the author writes, quote, "His cute face reminded me of an army of croakers I had encountered on my trip long ago." Now compare this line to a quote from page 115 of Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon, quote, "As I lie in bed tonight, I hear an army of frogs croaking up a storm out here where we ended our day's canoe ride." The similarities in the two sentences is an interesting coincidence for sure. And here are a couple of additional frog examples to highlight. In Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon, the main character's long-lost daughter's favorite stuffed animal is a frog. And the author Pete Bissonnette actually imported in real life 800-pound custom frog statues from Bali to his house in Minnesota. He then built a labyrinth in his backyard to house the statues, which he calls his Frogrinth. I'm not making this up. He incorporates this real-life story into the treasure book in its own chapter. So, frogs are an important part of both treasure hunts. What else? Well, in the Pokemon Box chapter, after the Froakie agrees to go on the trip to hide the treasure, the author wonders if he should train the Froakie. He writes, quote, "I thought about scheduling some training for the Froakie to assist him in becoming his more capable Greninja self." This concept of becoming a more capable version of yourself is another connection to Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon. The author Pete Bissonnette is the president of a company called Learning Strategies that provides self-improvement through self-help tapes called Paraliminals, and various Paraliminals are featured throughout Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon. In fact, in addition to being a treasure hunt, I felt the book was also one big advertisement for Pete's company, Learning Strategies, with a focus on evolving yourself to become better, very Pokemon-like. Now, this next connection is more tenuous, but I thought I would mention it anyway in case it helps someone. I've noticed that many Pokemon box hunters on Discord and Reddit have picked up on the possible wedding theme in the story. Lines like, quote, "My dad and his father wheeled over and hitched up the Jayco pop-up camper," or "I was just so happy the Froakie seemed so engaged." And it's also important to mention that the author gets introduced to Pokemon Go the first time in Portland, Maine on the way to a wedding. So all these things seem to point to the possibility of a wedding theme being important to finding the Pokemon box. Well, in Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon, the Butterscotch Five spontaneously decide to take a break from their treasure hunt to attend a wedding. And this is one of the last stops they make before arriving at the treasure location. Could be just a coincidence, but I think it might be more considering all the other connections between the two stories. And finally, the author in Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon hid his treasure in the ground under a piece of polished jasper. He did this so that treasure hunters would immediately know they were in the right spot because the jasper looked like it didn't belong with the rest of the environment.
So wrapped up in here, it will be hidden underneath this beautiful piece of jasper. Now,
I think this might connect to the Jazz Bar where the author of the Pokemon Box story meets the Froakie for the first time. Many people have hypothesized online that Jazz Bar might be a wordplay pointing us to a town called Jasper. There are some other possible connections one can make between the two stories, but I'm not sure how relevant they are. For instance, one of the characters in Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon is named Sue, and she has a belt made of valuable rubies that she claims gives her the ability to peer into the universe and see things. This reminded me of the Fabergé frog that peers through red ruby eyes. So what does all this mean? Well, I think it raises the idea that the 4 smaller There's Treasure Inside hunts could be based on previous book-based treasure hunts, and that those previous hunts could help reveal where the 4 boxes are hidden. For instance, look at the first box, the Forest Fenn box. We know that this one is definitely modeled off of the Forest Fenn book, The Thrill of the Chase. I think the author may have made this the first of the part 2 chapters in order to give us this clue, the idea that other book hunts will help with the solves. Next, we have the Pokemon Box hunt and its connection to Breakfast, Tea and Bourbon. Then we have the Past and Future Box chapter with the connection to Ready Player One. When Ready Player One was originally released, it too had a connection to a real-world treasure hunt where the winner would receive a custom 1981 DeLorean if they could figure out the clues in the book.
There's an Easter egg hidden in the book. It's not hidden in the ebook, but it's hidden in the print editions of the book, both the hardcover and the softcover. And if you can find this hidden website address in the book, it leads you to the first of 3 increasingly difficult video game challenges. And the first person to complete all 3 of these will win this card.
And finally, the Appalachian Trail box. Does this one have a corresponding previous book hunt connection? I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me at this point if it turns out that it does. After all, maybe that's why the author picked the name There's Treasure Inside as the title of his book. The inside could refer to the idea that we need to look inside other treasure hunt books for these connections. Maybe The 4 boxes are homages to other books or authors who have helped make armchair treasure hunts popular. After all, Jon Collins-Black would likely have studied all of these hunts to learn and get ideas when he started writing his own treasure hunt book. Why not give a little nod back to the people who blazed the way? So, what can we learn from the solve of Breakfast Tea and Bourbon that could be applied to the Pokemon Box story? Well, earlier I mentioned that the main character's name is Nelson Ware, and you could find the start of the hunt by anagramming his name as New Orleans. Maybe the tie-in to the Pokemon story is that when the author mentions breakfast and that he scarfed down his scrambled eggs could be a reference to scrambled clues, like an anagram. It wouldn't surprise me if Jon Collins-Black wants us to anagram one of the characters' names in the book to come up with a starting point for the hunt. For instance, if we take the direct parallel, let's anagram the main character's name, the one who's eating the scrambled eggs. But let's take his name as it would have appeared when he was 5 and a half, not after he changed it years later to Jon Collins-Black. Let's use his original name, John Comer. If we anagram it, we get Monroe, JC. And it turns out that Monroe, Louisiana is on the way from New Orleans to Hot Springs, Arkansas. In fact, it's very close to the place where the characters in Breakfast Tea and Bourbon stopped to go canoeing and where the main character heard, quote, the army of frogs croaking. Definitely an interesting possibility for the start of the hunt. Another idea is maybe the word scarfed is simply the breakfast clue connection to Breakfast Tea and Bourbon. At one point in the story, JCB writes, if you've played the Pokemon video game, you know it's fairly simple. The game is a hunt, and the Pokemon characters are the treasure. He then goes on to provide these pictures he created of a Froakie and a Greninja. And if you compare these, quote, artistic interpretations to actual images of a Froakie and Greninja, you notice that the necks of each Pokemon have been modified. For instance, the Froakie is missing the bubbles that normally surround his neck, and the Greninja is missing his very long tongue that wraps around his neck, like a scarf. I think these omissions, the bubbles in the tongue, could be clues that the author wants us to see when he makes the breakfast reference, I scarfed down my scrambled eggs. Okay, well, by now you're probably wondering how the Breakfast Tea and Bourbon treasure hunt was solved. Maybe one or more of these techniques could help us find the Pokemon box. The good news is the solve of Breakfast Tea and Bourbon was relatively simple once you knew where to look. First, the author used the very specific release date and time of the book to give clues to the treasure hunt location. The hunt began on Thursday, February 9th, 2017 at 5:08 p.m. Central Time. And if you reverse the date, you get 71902, which is the zip code of Hot Springs, Arkansas, where the treasure was ultimately found. Second, the cover of the hardback book had a series of embossed circles which represented all the stops the treasure hunters made in the story on their trip from New Orleans to Hot Springs. And if you knew the starting location of New Orleans, you could use the distances mentioned in the book with the map from the cover of the book to arrive at Hot Springs. And finally, the book had this line, quote, of all the clues, Ho Daddy Tis Tis Prettify Intrafly South Georgia was the most revealing. What did this mean? Well, the author also mentioned in interviews that he thought the person who found the treasure was someone who would have read the book and, quote, put 2 and 2 together.
I've been posting my personal Facebook page. Are there any clues in those? Well, there could very well be, but like I say, you don't need them. Just enjoy them, and maybe you might put 2 and 2 together and discover something else out.
This was a clue to connect the first 2 letters of each word in this gibberish phrase to spell Hot Springs. Then, building off this concept of putting 2 and 2 together, the family that found the treasure combined 2 different treasure hunt directions from different chapters in the book to know where to look in Hot Springs National Park. The key set of directions actually came from a flashback told earlier in the story. And I think this is another parallel with the Pokemon Box chapter. The author flashes back to when he was 5 and a half in New Orleans at the beginning of the story, and then describes hiding the treasure with the Froakie 40 plus years later. Following the Breakfast Tea and Bourbon model, it wouldn't surprise me if we need to combine clues from both parts of the Pokemon story to uncover the treasure location, like the Winning family did in Breakfast Tea and Bourbon. That could be why, right before hiding the treasure, the author writes, as I followed, each step began to remind me of being 5 years old again. Here, he's making a direct reference to a flashback. Maybe he's indicating that this is where you insert the clues you uncovered earlier during the flashback in New Orleans. I don't know, but I feel like the similarity between the 2 solves is intentional. So where does this leave us? Well, I think the number of similarities between the 2 books and the fact that at least 3 of the 4 small box hunts heavily reference other book-based treasure hunts means connections to other hunts is a theme I intend to explore further. And if this idea interests you, then I suggest you might want to get a copy of The Ultimate Guide for Armchair Treasure Hunts by Jenny Kyle. Jenny is the creator of the Mysterious Writings Forum that helps connect and educate armchair treasure hunters. I found the book does a really nice job of summarizing the puzzles and solves of previous hunts, and it's a quick way to learn the tips and tricks of the armchair treasure hunting world. In fact, in another interesting coincidence, in the book, Jenny describes her first ever treasure hunting experience with the hunt called A Treasure Trove from 2004. The prizes for this hunt were a number of jewel-encrusted animals, mostly insects. This reminded me of all the bug Pokemon listed in the Pokemon Box chapter. Who knows, maybe A Treasure Trove is another book-based hunt that could help us find the Pokemon Box. Well, that's all I've got for today's video. On my next video, I'll explain the place where I believe the scarf down my scrambled eggs clue is directing us to go. See you then.